project actually took us 2 weeks to complete. So it was the first video game that we made. In our first lesson, almost a month ago, we learned the basic characteristics of a video game, and we were all looking forward to creating one. So here we have our first video game created over the last 2 weeks. So here's the character that the player controls. And the objective is to fire a ball from the character and to get the ball to hit the butterfly. And the butterfly moves in a not very predictable way, but the player character always responds predictably to the player input. So here's our code. We have the 3 sprites in the sprites area at the bottom right corner. Yeah, we have the player character first of all, which is this guy that we control. And these 2 events are triggered by the up arrow and down arrow, these 2 scripts, and they control how the character moves. And as for the beach ball, we don't need this part. So the beach ball responds to the user pressing the space key. And whenever the space bar is pressed, it does this. It shows and goes to the player character, and then it moves right until it touches either the edge or the butterfly. And then it hides again. And how about the butterfly? Well, the butterfly starts falling down as soon as the green flag is clicked. It goes to the top right corner. It falls down and turns until it hits the bottom edge, and then it does this over again. And of course, when the butterfly touches the beach ball, it says ouch. We do that in a separate script because we don't want that to interfere with our main script. So if we look at this script here, as soon as the green flag is clicked, the butterfly checks repeatedly whether it is touching the beach ball. And if it is, then it says ouch for 1 second, and then hides the message. So that's pretty much our project for the last 2 weeks. Today we're going to start a new project that we will finish today. And before we move on, there was also a concept that we learned last week, which was the types of blocks. For example, the point towards block, which we didn't see yet, but it's the motion tab, and it's very similar to many of the blocks that we learned. This is called a statement. And a statement, as we learned last week, is basically a command that tells the sprite to do something specific, like move 10 steps, and so on. And statements are always shaped like this. They have, they're shaped overall like a rectangle, except they have a little dent at the top and a bump at the bottom. Next, control flow blocks. These control, as you might remember, the order that blocks are run in, and which blocks are run, and when they are run. For example, the control flow blocks that we are using here in the Pico walking sprite are these 2. Both of these are blocks that start running a script whenever a certain key is pressed. And that's one type of control flow block. Another type looks like these. And these, the forever loop and the if-then block, which we saw last week. These the first one tells the sprite to run a set of blocks repeatedly, and this block, the if-then block, tells the sprite to run a set of blocks only if a certain yes or no value gives us a yes. So these are some of the most important concepts that we learned last week. And if we go back to our project, some blocks that we should note, in addition to the one that we just looked at, are the say something block. And as someone brought up last week, we have two say blocks. One of them says say a message for how many seconds, and the other one simply says say a message. And the difference, as we talked about last week, is that this block tells the sprite to display a message and hide it after this many seconds, while this block tells the sprite to display a message, but it doesn't tell it to hide the message. So it will keep displaying the speech bubble. And finally, in the sensing tab, which is a tab that we started looking at last week or 2 weeks before, we have the touching something block. It can be mouse pointer, it can be the edge, or it can be another sprite. All right, so that's pretty much all we have from last week. Now, something that you might have noticed from our last two projects. So there are many statements and control flow blocks as well that have something that looks like this in between. So last week we called these a slot for input. For example, we have these in many of the motion blocks, including the move how many steps block. And we also have this on some of the control flow blocks, including the if-then block, which we also learned last week. So, as we discussed before, the difference between this slot and this slot is that this is a number or text value, while this is a yes or no value. So values that are put in these kinds of slots, which we call inputs, tell the block exactly how it should do something. For example, move 10 steps. We'll tell it to move 10 steps in the direction it's pointing it. And we can change this number, like move minus 10 steps, which tells it to move in the opposite direction. And an example of a yes or no block is the touching something block, which we had in the sensing tab, and the or block, which we also learned yesterday. And if you remember the or block, it simply looks at two yes or no values and tells us whether one or more of them is true. So, for example, we can fit the or block or the touching mouse pointer block into the slot in the if-then block. And that will tell us to do whatever blocks we put here if the yes or no block that we put here is a yes. And of course, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, yes or no blocks, these types of blocks are called Boolean blocks. Boolean blocks, like that. That's just a special name for it. All right. So now we're going to have a look at the concepts that we're going to learn today in our final class. So first, First, we're going to learn how to customize this stage and create costumes for the sprites. So if you look at our project from last week, the stage is white. That's the background that all the characters are behind. And we simply chose all of these 3 sprites from the Choose a Sprite window, which gives us a lot of built-in sprites. But sometimes we can't find the sprite that we need, and we want to paint a new sprite. And we'll learn how to do that this week. And also, how can I create many copies of the same sprite? So here, in this game, we have 1 player character, 1 butterfly, and 1 beach ball. But if we want to, say, create many copies of the beach ball or many copies of the butterfly, we wouldn't necessarily have to duplicate this character many times. There's a feature in Scratch that allows us to create copies of the same sprite called cloning, and we will look at that later. And this one's a big one. How do I keep track of data? So here in this game, we could have created like a score counting system that tells us how many times we hit the butterfly, but we didn't learn how to do that yet. And this class, our project will require us to do that. And finally, we're going to learn how to make things happen randomly. As we discussed previously, randomness is always a really important feature of a good game. And we want to learn how to do that. If you see here, the butterfly is, although it's moving, it isn't, it's moving pretty predictably. And we wanted to learn how to make it move more randomly. So let's have a look at our project for this week. This is not a video game. The player doesn't control anything. It's more like an animation, which is basically a picture that moves. So if we click on the green flag, first we see the backdrop. It isn't blank like this is. There's all these balloons. These are all, this whole picture is a part of the stage, and we're going to learn how to do that this class. And also, we see this, the confetti. So all of these are the same sprite, and the different colors are simply different costumes of the sprite. Lynn, do you have a question?
Are we going to finish all of this today?
Well, if not all of it, then definitely most of it. So first, something to observe. So if we look at the confetti, they're all starting from this point, and they're being thrown up, and then they fall down. So first, the sprites have different speeds when they first appear. So some of the confetti particles start with a really high speed horizontally, and they quickly go in this direction or this direction toward the wall, and some of them fall down pretty vertically. And also, look how the sprites fall. They all fall, their vertical speed increases as they fall. So the the longer they've been in the air, the faster they are. And that's how things fall in the real world. Things, as we call them, accelerate. They become quicker as they fall. And doing this will require us to keep track of some data, which we will use variables to accomplish. All right, any other questions before we start? All right, let's get started. So as usual, we're going to create a new Scratch project. Make sure you're signed in. And when you are, click Create at the top left corner of the Scratch website. So we have this familiar starter project with a cat. We're not going to need it, so we click the garbage can to get rid of it. And here's the first thing we notice. After we clicked away the sprite, now the stage is selected. So the stage is at the stage button is at the far right side of the screen near the bottom. If you click on it, it will show you actually the blocks and the code for the stage. So even the stage can have code in it. But we're not going to look at that this class. When we have selected the stage and we want to add new backdrops to the stage, which is basically this balloon background here, there are a couple of things we can do. We can either click on this button at the bottom right corner of the stage, the one that says choose a backdrop, and we choose the backdrop from there. Like sprites, there are many built-in backgrounds in Scratch, and we can find the one with the balloon here. The one is called Party. And there's also a search bar here. You can type Party, and it will give you this. Once you click on it, the stage becomes like this. And another way to do it is to first we make sure to click on the stage so that it's selected, and then we go to the top left corner of the screen and we click on the tab that says backdrops. We see we have our default blank backdrop as well as our party backdrop. And at the bottom, we see the choose a backdrop button. Yep, that's the one in. And we click on it. And that gives us the same screen. And we can click on a random one. And that adds a new backdrop. And we can switch between the backdrops just by clicking on them. So now we only need the party backdrop. We don't need the other two. So we can click on both of them and delete. So now we only have the party backdrop. So now we look at how to create the sprite here. So as we mentioned before, we only need one sprite to create this whole effect. But the sprites isn't like anything we've seen in the choose a sprite window. So instead of using that, we're going to hover our mouse over the choose a sprite button. So we're not clicking it, but we have our mouse over it. And then we see these 4 buttons: upload sprite, surprise, paint, choose a sprite. We're going to click on the 3rd button down, the one that looks like a paintbrush. It says paint. Once we're there, we see a new blank sprite here named sprite1. We can call it confetti instead. And then if we look at the left side of the screen, instead of this, we see this. So Scratch automatically gives us the costumes tab once we click this button to create a new sprite. And we can start using these painting tools to create a sprite. So first, let's look at the left section of the screen here. These are the painting tools that we have to create images for our sprite. So if we look here, the confetti is basically a rectangle that has different colors. There are actually, if you look closely, 4 different colors: red, green, turquoise, /blue, and purple. But we're going to start with 1. So if you look at these tools, at the very bottom, you see the one that looks like a square or rectangle. And once you select it, you see two boxes here. One that says fill and one that says outline. So first, let's click on the fill. And we have these 3 sliders here. So you can try playing around with the sliders, and they will give you different colors. So basically, you play around with the sliders until you have the color you want. First, we're going to start with purple. You can choose any color you want. And once you're done, it saves by itself. Yeah, I'm going to start with purple. And there is another box here that says outline. We don't want the confetti to have any outline. So we click on here and we click the bottom left corner. The one that looks like this. So this means no outline. So now we've adjusted our options for the rectangle, but we don't see any rectangle in it. To draw a rectangle on the costume, we simply click and drag. That's too big. We can make it smaller. So first, we drag the rectangle so that the cross here is centered on the canvas. There's like a cross shape here that looks something like this, and we drag this cross so that it goes right here. And that moves the sprite to the center. It moves the costume to the center. And we make this really small. We do this by dragging the circles here. Yeah, that's it. And if we can't move it by the mouse, we can use the arrow keys to move it and get it to the center. All right, looks like that. And one more thing to notice, if you look up here, each costume of a sprite has a name. the default name is costume 1. We're going to rename it to simply the number 1. And this is important because we're going to use it later in our code. So the costume is called 1. All right, I'm going to continue. So now we don't have to go through this whole process of drawing the rectangle again. We only have to create three more costumes that only changes the color of the rectangle. So we're going to right click and click duplicate, duplicate, duplicate. And we see that Scratch automatically changes the costume names to 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is what we want. So we can leave it like that. And then we want to choose 4 costumes of different colors. So we go to each of the costumes. Let's say we start with costume 2. Make sure that the select tool is selected. That's the one that looks like a mouse. And we click on the rectangle. We look at the 2 boxes that we saw earlier. And to change the color, we simply change what is selected in the fill box. So click here and change this to another color, like orange, for example. Yep, that's a good shade of orange. You can play around with this a little. And once you're done, click anywhere else on the screen and the rectangle will change. And we do something similar with the last 2 costumes. Click on it, click on the rectangle, and instead of purple, this time make it blue. And for the last one, we click here again, and we make it green. You can choose any 4 colors you want. I'm going to wait a bit for you to finish. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Are you done with this part? Okay. Done? Okay. Now let's move on to the code. So first, we want the sprite to start here at the top. So we can go to the motion tab and the code tab, and we drag one of the go-to blocks here. X can be 0, and Y something like 140. And we go to the events tab and find the when green flag click button. And we drag this here. And now we get a forever loop. And then we're going to do something we haven't done before. But first, do you have this? Okay. So the block that we're going to learn is in the control tab, this tab here. When we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to find 3 blocks. When I start as a clone, create a clone of myself and delete this clone. So these have to do with something in Scratch called cloning, which we mentioned at the start of this class. So this is the tool that Scratch has to make a character make many copies of itself. So for example, if we drag the create clone of myself here, that's this block, into the forever loop, that will tell the sprite to continue creating a copy of itself. And we don't want to make it created too frequently. So we go to the top of the control tab and we drag one of the wait 1 second block. And instead of 1 second, we make it 0.02, let's say. All right. So now we have this, and it tells the confetti to make a clone of itself repeatedly. Oh, and we didn't want this itself to show. We only want the clones to show. So we also go to the next tab and look at find the hide block and snap it here. So it's outside the forever loop. All right. For now, we're only telling it to create clones of itself repeatedly. After the clones are created, they're just going to stay right here, and nothing interesting is going to happen. But the thing with clones in Scratch is that we can make them to do something on their own, which is, if you're up here, fall down. So first, how do we make it fall down? That's going to be the first topic that we're going to code. So we've already seen in the control tab, when I start as a clone block. This is what one of the blocks that we're going to use. And this tells the clones of the sprite to do something to do something on its own. And we see that the particles stop when they hit the edge. So we can also use in the control tab, the repeat until block. And here we go to the sensing tab and we drag the touching block here and make this touching edge. All right. And after it touches the edge, it waits for a second and then it disappears. So we go back to the control tab and we drag the wait 1 second block after the repeat until block, and we scroll down and we find the delete this clone block and put it right after the wait 1 second block. But we didn't tell it to move yet. And to do that, we're going to introduce a new concept, which is variables. So we've mentioned this a little when we said that we want to learn how to store data, and this is where that comes in handy. So we want to store data about how fast the sprite is going, both horizontally and vertically, so that the sprite will move according to its current speed and adjust the speed based on how fast, how long it's been in the air. So we're going to need two variables. We're going to call them x speed and y speed. And x refers to how fast it's going horizontally, left to right, and y refers to how fast it's going up to down. So first we notice something. X speed remains the same, and it's a different random value for each clone particle. So as the particle flies through the air, its horizontal speed is always the same, and it starts as a random value for every clone of the sprite, for every little particle that we see here. And also, the y speed changes. If you look at here, the particles are actually thrown up a little bit in the air at first, but then it starts accelerating downwards. So the y speed increases as the clones fall down. So essentially, the longer it's been in the air, the faster it goes up and down, but its left and right speed stays the same. And finally, x and y speeds are unique to every clone. So each particle has its own left, horizontal, and vertical speed. And all of these can be done with variables. All right. So back to our code. On the left side of the screen, the second to last tab. This one's labeled variables. And if we click here, we see that there's already a variable that's built in for us. It's named my variable. And there are a few blocks that go with it. We can set this variable to some value. This is always either a number or a text. Like we can set it to 0 or 1, 3, hello. That's all fine. If this is a number, we can also increase or decrease it by a certain number. And also we can show the variable on the stage. And this also relates to these two blocks. Show, hide, show, hide. And if we set it to show, then it basically displays this little square on the stage. And it tells us what the variable is currently set to. And for example, if we set it to something like 5, that's the variable, and we can also increase it based on its current amount. That does it. So those are what we can do with the variable. And we can also break this variable somewhere on the code. So for example, when the value of this variable is 23, then if we have this variable in our code and we put it somewhere in a statement, then it will tell us in this without number or text block here, it stands for whatever value the variable contains. For example, if the variable equals 23, then this little orange block, it stands for the number 23. And if it's 24, if it's 26, then this stands for 26. If it's 5, this stands for 5. And if it's hello, then it stands for the text, the word hello. So if we wanted to make this like 20, for example, and we set this variable to the number 20, and then we drag this variable into the move something steps block. So now it reads move my variable steps. This basically means move whatever number of steps that my variable contains, in this case 20. So click on this. Every time this block is run, it moves the sprite by 20 steps. And if we set this to minus 20, then it moves 20 steps in the opposite direction. And sometimes we don't really need to know the exact value of this variable. We only want to use it in the code. So we can hide this from the stage. And if we change a variable value, this will still work. And now it's not minus 35, and it moves 35 steps in the opposite direction. So now we're going to look at how we can apply this in getting this to move. So we can delete our my variable, and we're going to make a new variable. So click on in the variables tab, click on the button make a variable, which is the first down from the top. We're going to enter a name for the variable, which is x speed. And we're going to make it for this sprite only, because the speed of the sprite is it's a property of the clones. And so each clone can have a different value for this variable. And that can only happen if this variable is selected for this sprite only. So once we have a name for this, we click OK. And we have the x speed here. We're going to make another variable and call it y speed. And like this one, we make this for this sprite only. So now we have an x speed and a y speed variable. And we have these 4 blocks here. Although we only have 4 blocks, we can select from here which variable we want to talk about, if it's x speed or y speed. So now that we have these 2 variables, we can hide them first of all, because we don't need to know what they are. We just need the code to know. And we're going to drag the 2 of the set blocks into our code. So one should say set x speed to something, and one should say set y speed to something. And we drag these two blocks right after when I start as a clone block, before the repeat until block. So this is what we have now. And we can set the y speed to something like 5. That's the speed that it starts with. And the x speed to, I'll leave it at 0. We're going to make this a random value later. All right. So now, in the repeat block, we wanted to keep increasing the y speed as long as it keeps falling. So we're going to use the other block that we saw, which is change variable by something. We're going to replace x speed with y speed here, and we make this -1, because if we remember from our previous lectures, a positive y value means it's going up, and a negative y value means it's going down. So change y speed by -1 means that it's gaining speed down. So we're going to drag this in the repeat loop. But if we're just changing around the variables, nothing much will happen. We're actually going to add motion blocks so that these variables can be, they can affect the way it moves. So in the motion tab, there are 2 blocks that we learned: change x by and change y by. Change x by means telling the character to change its left to right value, and change y by means telling it to change its up to down value. So we're going to need both this time: change x by something and change y by something. And of course, the something here is the speed it's going in. So it should read change x by x speed and change y by y speed. And if we saw what we did earlier with the my variable that's now been deleted, we can put the drag the x speed here and the y speed here. And finally, we want it to rotate. So we go to the motion tab, and we drag the turn something to leaves block right after the change x by and change y by blocks. So now it looks like this. Oh, oops. We forgot to show the clones. So one more thing, go to the left tab and find the show block and put it here. So this is in the clone script. All right. That doesn't look very pretty. So we definitely want the sprites to have like a left to right motion. How about we set this to 2 or 3? So if you saw here, all the confetti all of the particles have a different speed, and this can be done with random. So here's a new block that we're going to learn. It's in the operators tab, which is the green circle. It's the same tab that we saw with the OR block, but this time we're going to use the pick random block. So this basically gives us a random value that's in between these 2 numbers. Let's make them -15 and 15, because they're the x speeds that we want the sprite to have. If we just click on it, it'll give us the random number that it, well, gives us. And it looks pretty random. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this into the setXspeed block. So the initial x speed is a random number from -15 to 15. And now this looks a bit better. And we don't want it to be just purple. We want the other costumes too. So we're going to do something similar with the random block. We're going to make it 1 to 4, which are the 4 costumes here. And here's the reason we number them 1 to 4. So the costumes names are 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is because we want to use the pick random block to set the costumes. So if we go to the next tab, we're going to another new block, which is the switch costume to block. So here's the name of all the costumes we have. And conveniently, they are the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if we want to have a random one of these, we simply drag this in here. So we have switch costume to pick random 1 to 4. And we put this right after the show block here, the clone script. And now we have the different colors. All right. Are you done your code? Okay. So a brief review of all the blocks that we learned. First of all, we have, let's first talk about the backdrops. So I'm going to ask you, how do we add a new backdrop? There are 2 ways. Do you remember? I do remember. Well, the first is using the choose a backdrop button at the bottom right corner. And that gives us access to this screen where we can click on the backdrops that we want to add or type here to find a specific backdrop that we want. And another way to customize the backdrops is to go to the stage, backdrops tab, and do it from here. The results are the same, but here in the backdrops tab and the stage selected, we can see all the backdrops that it currently has, and we can customize them if we have more than one. And next, does anyone know how to paint a sprite from scratch? We use the choose a sprite button, except we don't click it. Instead, we use one of these 4 buttons here. It's the paintbrush button. This gives us a new sprite, and we can use all the painting tools here to paint out the sprite that we want. There's the paintbrush. There's also the rectangle, which we used. And of course, we can customize the color that it's in. And we can also create multiple costumes. And we can duplicate costumes. Let's delete this. Here are the 4 costumes that we had for this confetti sprite. And we also learned a lot of concepts, including cloning, which is making many copies of the same sprite. There are the control tab, and there at the bottom here. There are 3 blocks related to cloning. When I start as a clone, create a clone of myself, and delete this clone. And we use them all. We put the create clone of myself in the forever loop in this main script. And when I start as a clone block, this starts the clone script. And here this script controls everything that the clone does. And at the end of the script, we have the delete this clone block, which tells the clone to disappear. And then we learn how to use variables. There in the orange variables tab, we learn some basic functions with variables, like setting the variable to something. It can be a text or a number, changing the variable by a certain number, as well as accessing the content of the variable using these number or text blocks. And those can be used in any block that has a slot or an input slot like this. And finally, we learned how to get ourselves a random number using the pick random block, which is in the operators tab. And this is pretty much our project. So it looks pretty complicated, but it really isn't. Any questions? Oh, and since this is our final project, I'm going to give you this link. It's in the chat now. And also, if you want a link that contains all the projects that we have so far, it's, hold on, here. It's also in the chat now. So the first link is, the first link in the chat is this project that we have here. And the second link is all the projects that we've done so far. All right. Thanks so much for coming. I hope to see you soon. Goodbye. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.